I'm Charlie Bright of Gold Derby, and I'm speaking with Ellen Kuras, the cinematographer for Pretend It's a City, the Netflix documentary where Martin Scorsese travels around Manhattan with Fran Lebowitz. Ellen, what do you know what made Martin Scorsese say to himself, I want to make a series all about Fran Lebowitz?
Well, we actually go way back. So Fran and Marty are very, very old friends. And I came on into the trio. It became a trio, actually, when we did public speaking. So many years ago, Marty asked me if I would do a film with him about Fran Lebowitz. And of course, I'm a New Yorker, consummate New Yorker. I live half my life in LA, but I've always stayed in New York. And so I've known about Fran for many years. In fact, I used to see Fran walking around. so I said, "Oh, sure, I count me in. I'm ready to do that." Because Fran, Fran is her particular brand of satire is so special that I thought, yeah, we have to capture this. So we did that film, a number of years ago, and then we came back for another round. And Marty says we have to do another round with Fran. I mean, it's just. She's so precious. She's a New York icon, so we had to capture it.
You really captured, your love for New York really showed through in the way that this documentary was shot. And I'm curious as to how do you go about, translating that love for this city into a visual way? How do you plan about capturing that?
Well, one of the things that Marty and I talked about in the very beginning that was very important is intimacy, because New York has been shot so many times. And the thing about Fran is that you want to feel like you're walking around the city with her. So we talked a lot about, how we were going to do that, and I, walking handheld around the city doesn't exactly work because you get that kind of jostling as the person who's carrying the camera walks. So, and Marty didn't want to do a Steadicam. So as it turns out, Sony just came out with a new camera called the Venice, and they have an extension whereby you can take a cord, which goes from the camera body to a sensor and put a lens on the sensor. So I could walk around the city just holding the lens and the sensor while my camera assistant was holding the body. So we were basically a very small team of people walking around the city. And basically, Sony, I called up Sony and I said, I've heard you have this new device on the camera, this new extension. And they said, well, it's still in prototype. We haven't put it out yet. And I said, but this is for Marty. We have to do this. It's for Fran and Marty. And so, of course, they gave it to us. And it made all the difference because I was really able to get up close and intimate with Fran when we were walking around and not draw so much attention. And because, of course, that is, saying that not drawing too much attention is kind of crazy because everybody in New York knows Fran, and even more so now, because she's just such a character that people would stop and ask her questions while we were filming. So
part of me is actually hoping that when you first said it's for Marty, they're like, "Oh yeah, big deal." But then when you brought up Fran Lebowitz, they were like, "Oh, okay, now we'll let it happen."
Yeah, exactly. That would probably be the case, right? So the other dimension of that is that we had long, extensive interviews, and when we did the first film, we actually did it in the Waverly restaurant, and this one, Marty said, "I want this to be more relaxed. I wanted to feel like it's, a conversation between friends." So we ended up going to the Players Club off of Gramercy Park. And I basically lit it. I had a whole team of people that were behind us. We had 3 cameras. And it enabled Fran to feel relaxed enough that she could just talk. And, Marty and Ted Griffiths were asking her questions just about so many different aspects of New York life. So I really wanted it to look in a way that we felt like we were sitting at the table, to feel intimate as well, and to be like a photograph or to be a portrait of Fran. So the lighting, I made it like a portrait because the Players Club is covered with portraits of famous actors and famous players. And so I wanted it to feel like it was part of that genre as well.
So, one of the things other than Fran and Marty, I think probably the biggest star of that of the documentary is that mini New York City set that Fran was walking around on. That reconstruction of the city, which was so incredible. I wanted to be there so I could just look at all the details of everything. Are you able to give us any of those details about that model that we saw throughout the series and how that came about?
Well, and for all the years I've lived in New York, I've never been there to the Queen's Museum. And when we went there, Marty said, "I want to shoot at the Queen's Museum at the diorama." And I said, "Okay." So when I went to go scout, we all went to scout, Fran, Marty, and myself. I couldn't believe it. It was so lifelike. And, I had to change the lighting just a tiny bit just to make it feel like it was as if you were looking in the plane, looking down from LaGuardia as you're landing LaGuardia. And I had just come in to LaGuardia like the week before, and I showed Marty a picture I had taken out of the plane, and I said, "Marty, this is exactly the same. I mean, it's crazy." So the whole thing about that is that it is so delicate and fragile that when we first started going out and we started filming, we couldn't put our cameras out in the middle. We had to put them on the very edge. So there I was. I had my camera as I was slipping and sliding around in the Hudson River. And Fran, of course, comes up and she shuffles up, through from the Verrazanos and comes all the way up. And as it turns out, she ends up stepping over the Manhattan Bridge and knocks over the Manhattan Bridge. There goes the Manhattan Bridge. And she's like, "No, you can't show that. You can't show that." So it's like, it was
Godzilla versus Lebowitz.
Right. No, but it's a metaphor for the whole city as well, I mean, and that's the whole thing about Fran and her being representative of the city and how, the city is kind of a macrocosm of the world. There's so many different people. There are more ethnic groups in Queens than anywhere else in the world. And so, she sort of embodies the character of New York. And I know that when Pretend It's a City came out, during the pandemic, which is still going on, everybody was calling all of us and emailing us and saying, so important to see this, that we see how it is and how it was. It was so important to be reminded of life, life as we know of it, because everything has changed now.
And especially also with New York getting so hit so hard by the pandemic in the early days of it. Were there any aspects of this series that were harder to shoot than you expected them to be, other than, of course, Fran Lebowitz destroying the Manhattan Bridge?
Well, yes. I mean, certain parts were, for me, was challenging not to make look literal. Is how do we make this feel photographic? How do we make it so it doesn't feel just like hardcore documentary? Because, as I've done a lot of documentaries, but I shot Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind. And so I'm always looking to see, how can I see this in a way that's less figurative, that's not literal representation of something. And so that was a challenge for me. I mean, when we were going down and Fran was walking through the streets of New York, is how do you give it some character that goes beyond just it being a document of what's happening. And I really think that the editors did a masterful job of being able to put together this piece so that it becomes larger than itself. It becomes larger than the stories even that Fran is telling. The way that the music and the way that the editing and some of the film clips that have come in, make it much more about life and representative about life. When you think about, how it's been broken down into different sections. So you have, the first section, which is Pretend It's a City, which is, it's like, look people at what's in plain sight, that everybody now today is missing what's in front of their faces because they're so busy looking at their phones, or they're so busy going from point A to point B that they forget to look at life itself. And in a way, Fran reminds us, look at life itself. Here we are, be present. And so those are the kind of things that we take with us that make it long lasting, that have resonated with so many people, is that they've really taken it in and saying, yeah, you know, I mean, and during the pandemic, I think during that pause, it enabled everybody to stop and say, what is my life really about? You know, who am I and what am I doing? And what is my life going to be like after when we restart again? And in a way, Fran, you know, she had her finger on it very early on of saying, you know, remember what's right in front of your face. Look at the sidewalk. There's a lot of things that you never would know that are there. And then there's cultural affairs, which, you know, is so great. I love all of those moments with Fran and Spike. And I have a whole history with Spike, having shot Summer of Sam and done many movies with Spike, and we just did American Utopia. And so to see that come back again, I shot all the backgrounds for all of that, for that series that we did, and we did it a number of years ago. But Marty wanted to have a moving backdrop of New York. So I actually went out with a hand crank camera that was given to Marty and did moving backgrounds. And I did a lot of time lapses, and then we put them on LED screens in the background. But the whole interchange between Spike and Fran, I mean, that is so New York. That's so Fran, so Spike. I mean, even though I've seen it many times, I still have to laugh out loud, you know, and just seeing the juxtaposition of those two, of Spike saying, you know, what do you mean you don't like sports? And Fran going, you know, having gone to the greatest fight of all time. And so those are the ironies that, you know, come through this series again and again.
Well, Ellen, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on our panel in just a little bit.
That's great. Thanks so much, Charlie.